I will confine myself to the subject matter at hand, and which is, should human rights always outweigh religious rights? As we all know, religions are essentially a system of ideas which the adherents happen to claim to be from a divine source. Nevertheless, they're still a system of ideas, and how do ideas have rights? Religious rights will always have conflicting parties. For example, the Muslims will say it is the right of Muslims to say Isa is only prophet of God. But this will, of course, offend the Christians. The Christians, on the other hand, will say that Jesus or Isa is the Son of God. And this will offend the Muslims. So religious rights are meaningless. What is relevant is the right of a person to say, to declare his or her own belief in a given space. Human rights, on the other hand, are real in the sense that they affect a living, sentient being, and we can actually experience human suffering when our rights are violated. Now, a religious right, however, is different in the sense that it is people who say that the religion is offended when someone leaves the religion. An apostate, for example. And in traditional Islam, they say that this right, Islam has the right, or Muslims have the right to disallow apostasy. So religion's rights cannot, in view of this, I would say that religion's rights cannot take precedent over human rights because there is no legal owner to the religion to levy any kind of rights against the rights of the person. Even the Prophet of Islam, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, cannot claim ownership to the religion. But Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah 5:3-5, for example, says, but if it comes to Islam and human rights, this is a different matter altogether, and both Professor Piscatori and Dr. Farouk have very ably elucidated on that, on the rights. And the question is whether Islam and human rights are compatible, even though the topic is religious rights, but I'm going to focus specifically on Islam like the other two speakers have. Now, Islam is a tradition with multiple strands of thought. We have the conservatives, well, some might even call them Islamo-fascists. Well, I have a friend who describes the conservatives as conservative Muslims as Islamo-fascists. Then, of course, we have the reformist Islam, Sufism, Shiism, and so on. Now, all these trends represent human interpretations of revelation. But in extreme right-wing conservative Islam, there are elements which contravene human rights, which has already been explained by Dr. Farouk, completely. And the example of this is that they maintain that there is no freedom of conscience, meaning that there is no freedom for a person to choose his or her own religion. So in most Muslim countries, Muslims are not allowed to convert out of Islam, and if they do, they will attract capital punishment. However, if we read the Quran and Hadith, which conform, meaning the Hadith which conform to the Quran, we will find that the Quran is foremost in the defense of human rights. The Quran does not use the term human rights because it's a relatively modern term. I suppose it's known as haq an-nas in Arabic, but the notion of human rights is not alien to the Quran. And the Quran has injunctions to believers to fulfill their role towards humanity as a whole. Therefore, it is the right of humanity to expect human rights from those who believe in the Quran. The Quran gives, for example, I'm just going to quote a few examples. Quran gives complete and conditional freedom of conscience. This surah the particular surah has already been quoted. This is Al-Baqarah 2, 256, which says, let there be no compulsion in religion. And again in Surah 10, 9900, it says, wilt thou compel mankind against their will to believe? And this is directed at Prophet Muhammad. Not even the Prophet, for example, was allowed to compel or tyrannize anyone to believe, but rather he is to remind the people. And Surah 50, 45 says, and I quote, and thou art not one to overawe them by force, so admonish with the Quran, such as fear my warning. And the Quran, this is but one example. The Quran also mentions haqqan ma'lum, or known rights. And Surah 70:24 speaks about the wealth of people, of those people who are in focus towards Allah, musallin, who must give due rights to the poor. And the Quran also mentions liberating oppressed people who seek liberation. And it is the duty of any Islamic system to do so. And this is Surah An-Nisa. And the most mentioned prophet in the Quran is Moses, or Musa, who is mentioned 136 times in 31 chapters. And his most mentioned task is the emancipation of the children of Israel, which is essentially a human rights exercise. And the Pharaoh of Fir'aun refused to give the children of Israel freedom of movement as well as freedom of belief. And Musa finally liberates them from the control of the Fir'aun. Therefore, it could be said that the Quran is a book which upholds human rights, although it gives the metaphysical basis for doing so, which is salvation. And a Muslim's social duty is what will contribute to spiritual well-being. And I should also mention that there's another surah which says that whoever kills one person is equivalent to killing the whole of humanity. And whoever saves one person is equivalent of saving the whole of humanity. And but to many, especially to the Islamic authorities, they have completely ignored the injunctions of the Quran, the teachings of the Quran. They've completely misinterpreted the teachings of the Quran with regard to human rights. And what they have done is to just not ignore. The reality is totally different. We have Islamofascists in many Islamic countries who, for reasons best known to themselves, have interpreted the Quran as the Quranic teachings as a religion which is coercive, which is unkind, which is the emphasis is mainly on punishment and not on kindness and justice, which is the first principle of the Quran. Is not the Quranic injunction of compassion and kindness and love are completely ignored. And the Shari'a, as we all know, there's so many versions of the Shari'a, and Dr. Farooq mentioned about the Cairo Declaration, where most of the rights which have been included in the Declaration are qualified by Sharia. And even the proponents of Sharia, what is Sharia? Even the proponents of Sharia are not even certain of the source. And as I said, different Islamic countries have different interpretations of the Sharia. And here in Malaysia, they have even added things which are not even in the traditional interpretation of Sharia, especially when it comes to moral policing, when it comes into intrusions into the private space of Muslims, like our Kalwat laws and so on and so forth. And most of the Sharia laws in this country are totally in violation, many of them are in violation of human rights as we know them. They are in violation of even the fundamental liberties enshrined in our constitution. And our fundamental liberties, like in most constitutions worldwide, have taken a lot of it are taken from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we have got, and of late, there have been so many instances of the Islamic authority, of the excessive behavior of the Islamic authorities. I mean, I can quote a whole laundry list. I don't know whether Dr. Farouk expects me to do that. From unilateral conversion of children, from the transgender case where in Seremban, where the transgenders were repeatedly arrested, abused, and charged in the Sharia court, to unilateral, well, not just that, and the body snatching, plus also the arrest of a Hindu bride in the middle of a wedding, and so on. It's a whole laundry list. And the problem is, the list is getting longer by the day. And recently, a couple of weeks ago, you even had the case of this poor chap called Wan Sulaiman, residing in Ipoh, Perak. Well, he wants to, well, he was studying the Quran to increase his knowledge. And he had certain questions which he consulted. He went to the Perak Mufti's office and also went to the religious authorities to discuss, and he wanted answers to his question. And one particular problem which he was puzzled about is the second limb of the Shahada. The Shahada is a declaration of faith where you say that Allah is the only God and Muhammad is his prophet. Because he says it's not in the Quran, the second limb is not in the Quran, nor is it he couldn't find any hadith. So he asked, and he was told to shut up. And instead of engaging him in a discourse, in a discussion, what they did was they arrested him, they went to his house, and they took all his writings, and then he had notes on his wall. They took away the notes, and they declared his house as public space. Now, even by a long stretch of the imagination, I mean, how can you declare a private home, private space? I mean, they make a mockery, not just of religion, but also of law. So these are the kind of things that's happening now, and which has given rise to a lot of concern amongst not just Muslims, but also non-Muslims. And then, of course, now the latest is the attempt by the Kelantan state government to impose hudud. We discussed that at length yesterday, which is causing fear and anxiety among especially Muslims. Because, of course, under our constitution, Sharia law, Sharia courts do not have jurisdiction over non-Muslims. Neither are non-Muslims, neither do Islamic law does not apply to non-Muslims. But regarding hudud, this was passed by the Kelantan State Assembly in 1993, November 1993, but they were not able to implement it because at that time, Dr. Mahathir was then the Prime Minister, was totally against it because it requires constitutional amendments. Professor Shad Faruqi, I'm sure, will elaborate more on that, which requires a 2/3 majority, of course. And apart from that, they also need to amend another act, which is called the Sharia Courts Criminal Jurisdiction Act of 1965, which imposes limits on the punishment that can be imposed by the Sharia courts, which is 3 years imprisonment, not more than 3 years imprisonment, 5,000 ringgit fine, and 6 strokes of the rotan. Am I right? And 6 strokes of the rotan, which is the cane. We still have corporal punishment here, Professor. So that is why, in this case, in March, they tried again. The past state government tried again, and it was unanimously passed by the Kelantan State Assembly, which was the amendments to the hudud bill. What is the term for it? The Sharia Criminal Code 2. Well, even because, well, they are clearly in the majority, and even I heard that the BN, the UMNO representatives, state assemblymen, asked the UMNO's Central Committee whether they could have permission to also vote in favor, because they did not want to be the odd man out. And the sole Pakatan Rakyat state assemblyman also did likewise. So it was unanimous vote. It was unanimously passed. But again, they have this hurdle, the constitutional hurdle. And, well, they have to, of course, amend the constitution, and they also need to amend the 65 Act. So that is why Hadi, the PAS leader, PAS is trying to table these two private members' bills. Well, at the moment, the government business has to take precedence. So it has not been tabled yet. And rumor has it that it never will. Well, I met some UMNO MPs, and they told me that, in fact, the chairman of the backbenchers, BN backbenchers, and they said it will probably die a natural death. And we suspect that the whole idea about tabling these bills is to simply burnish the credentials of PAS ahead of party elections. So hopefully this is the truth, and that there'll be no further attempt to push hudud against the will of the majority. But what is of concern, we all know that of course the reason behind it is politically motivated, but the problem is it is causing divisions, not just amongst the Muslims, but causing divisions between Muslims and non-Muslims, and causing divisions within the Muslims, because they have managed to dupe the Muslims, especially in the rural areas, and even some born-again Muslims in the urban areas, by saying that this is hukum Allah, this is God's law, and you cannot question it. And surprisingly, well, the problem is many Muslims are ignorant of what Islam is all about. And they depend on their kampung ustaz, whose knowledge of Islam is quite minimal. And they also depend on the Islamic authorities like Jakim, Jais, who are terribly conservative. And Jakim, for example, is going all out to push for the implementation of hudud. And even there's some quarters like Isma, for example, another supremacist group, who even says that hudud should apply to all Malaysians, regardless of religion. So this is a very worrying trend. But the problem is people like us, well, we dare not even object to hudud. I mean, we have to be very careful in the way that we object to hudud. Of course we do, but you know, it has to be framed in using the right words. Even for the G25, when we issued a statement on hudud, we said we do not reject hudud, even though we know it's only a very minor part of the Sharia, but there are preconditions before you can impose hudud. And we quoted many Islamic scholars, and especially Sheikh Dr. Yusuf Qaradawi, who is or was the chairman of the World Council of Ulamas. And of course, in spite of the problems he had in France and so on, and in his native Egypt, he's still very much revered here. So he said very, very clearly in a very long interview he gave to Al Jazeera that in order to impose hudud, you must apply ijtihad. But here, our conservative Islamic clerics have already closed the door ijtihad, and you cannot use the interpretation of ulama, of Islamic scholars of many centuries ago, and you know, and impose them on 21st century Islamic society. And you also said the preconditions are that you must have, first of all, perfect Muslim society in the sense that people are God-fearing, they are adherent Muslims, God-fearing, and so on. And then there must be no, you must provide full employment. There must be no, the gap between rich and poor must not be so large. So these are very, very strict conditions. And he also mentioned that in most Muslim countries who have imposed hudud, the problem is rich, corrupt businessmen in cahoots with equally corrupt politicians, political leaders. They steal from the public coffers, from the national coffers. They get away with it. But poor unemployed man who steals to feed his family, his hands get chopped off. So these are the injustices. And in fact, if you talk about justice, even Ibn Qayyim, who was a very famous Islamic ulama scholar of the late 13th century, he said, Sharia is about justice. If injustice occurs because of any rule of Sharia, then it is not Sharia. So you see, he recognizes and he acknowledges that Islam basically is about upholding justice. As I say, it's the first principle of Islam. But the hudud law, for example, I mean, this is the most extreme example because there are many, many other examples which I will not go into. The hudud of Kelantan, the past hudud, is all about punishment. The emphasis is on punishment. It's not about upholding justice. And even there's a very good analysis of the Kelantan Hudud Bill of '93 by Professor Hashim Kamali, who used to be a professor in the International Islamic University, but is now with the Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies. And he's done a very comprehensive analysis of Kelantan's Hudud Bill. And his conclusion is that it does not reflect the balanced outlook of the Quran, nor does it apply ijtihad. And he cited many other Islamic scholars who also feel that the imposition of hudud in the 21st century is out of sync. Is simply not tenable, nor is it practical. And also Professor Tariq Ramadan of Oxford University, he has called about 10 years ago, I think, for a moratorium by Muslim countries on the implementation of hudud. You might be wondering, why has Brunei, for example, our ASEAN neighbor, imposed hudud? Well, they can afford to do so because there's a very explicit provision in the hudud law which exempts the Sultan and the entire royal family from the operation of hudud law. Now, is that Islamic? It certainly is not, because Islam does not recognize a monarchy. Islam basically is a socialist religion which believes in equality of all persons. And as Professor James Piscatori has already mentioned, you are only, the distinction is only made through piety in the eyes of God. You are above some other people because there's equality. But if you are pious, then you are above all others in the sight of God. And with that, I think I better not take up too much time. I will pass it back to our moderator. Thank you.